The courtroom fell silent as a frail, 94-year-old man slowly shuffled to the stand. His gray hair barely hung on, his hands trembled slightly, and his every step echoed a life filled with memories. But what no one knew was that this old man wasn't just any senior citizen. Beneath his weak exterior lay the mind of a genius, one of the most respected attorneys the country had ever seen. Yet, today, in this very courtroom, no one took him seriously. The judge sneered, clearly unimpressed. "You're representing yourself?" he scoffed, glancing down at the elderly man. "I'm sure you're no stranger to the courtroom, but I doubt your memory's as sharp as it used to be." The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter as the elderly man sat, silently absorbing the mockery. But what they didn't know was that the truth was about to hit them harder than they could imagine. What happens when a 94-year-old attorney, dismissed as an irrelevant relic of the past, uncovers a lie so big that even the judge can't deny it? Stay with me, because this isn't the story of a man being underestimated. It's the story of a courtroom about to face a lesson in humility. The courthouse was a grand, intimidating building, with tall stone columns that loomed like silent witnesses to the many cases it had housed over the years. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of aged wood and leather, the walls lined with portraits of judges past. The hum of conversations and shuffling of papers filled the large, high-ceilinged courtroom where the final trial of the day was about to begin. At the front, behind a polished oak bench, sat Judge Harold Peterson, a man whose stern expression was only softened by years of experience and power. With thick glasses perched on the bridge of his nose and a robe that seemed to add weight to his already imposing presence, Judge Peterson exuded an air of authority. His gaze swept over the room, his sharp eyes noting the details of each individual. But as he glanced at the elderly man walking to the front of the room, a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. It wasn't just the man's age that caught his attention. It was the way he walked, slow, deliberate, like someone who had seen far more of life than anyone in the room could possibly understand. The elderly man, whose name was Benjamin Foster, was nothing like the typical figure one would expect in a courtroom. His once dark hair had long since faded to silver, and his face, lined with wrinkles, carried the weight of nearly a century's worth of wisdom. His back, once strong and straight, now curved slightly from age, but there was a calmness in his eyes that suggested strength. He moved with the aid of a walking cane, but it wasn't weakness that defined him. It was the sense of quiet authority that he emanated. As he took his place at the defense table, he gave the judge a respectful nod, but didn't speak a word. His frailty seemed to be his greatest disadvantage in the eyes of the people around him. But what they didn't know was that this man had spent decades in the courtroom, arguing complex legal battles. To them, though, he was just an old man, barely able to hold a pen steady. Judge Peterson's smirk deepened, a sign of his disbelief that this elderly man was about to represent himself in such a high-stakes case. The defendant, a young and cocky businessman named Richard Westbrook, leaned back in his chair, a smug smile crossing his face as he observed Benjamin. Westbrook was the type of man who had it all: wealth, arrogance, and the kind of confidence that comes with thinking you can buy your way out of anything. He barely even looked at the elderly man as he picked up his coffee mug, dismissing him as no more than a nuisance in the courtroom. Around the room, the murmurs of the audience were thick with skepticism. People whispered about the elderly man, calling him crazy for representing himself, mocking his decision. The judge raised an eyebrow, almost as if to say, "This is going to be entertaining." As Benjamin prepared to speak, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The courtroom felt heavier than it ever had before, each person waiting for him to prove himself or fall flat on his face. Little did they know, Benjamin Foster wasn't here to play games. He was here to win, and it was going to be a lesson no one would soon forget. The courtroom grew quieter as Judge Peterson adjusted his glasses, surveying the room with a critical eye. His gaze landed on Benjamin Foster, who sat at the defense table, his hands resting gently on the wooden surface. The elderly man's slight frame and trembling hands were all the judge needed to see to form his opinion. This would be an easy case. The judge leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, Mr. Foster," Judge Peterson began, addressing the elderly man with a mocking tone, "I must say, I'm impressed. It's not every day I see someone your age representing themselves. I hope you haven't forgotten the basics of courtroom protocol. But then again, I guess we can't expect a man of your age to keep up with modern law, can we?" The words hung in the air as the judge's subtle jab made the courtroom chuckle. Benjamin remained silent, his expression unchanged. His eyes, though, told a different story. While the judge and everyone else laughed at his expense, Benjamin held a calm demeanor, as if he were waiting for the storm to pass. He knew this would happen. He knew they would mock him for his age, for his appearance, and for daring to step into the courtroom to fight a case that everyone else had already written off. Richard Westbrook, the defendant, sat across the room with a smug grin plastered on his face. He was young, wealthy, and confident, convinced that his high-priced lawyer would be enough to see him through. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Henry Carter, was quick to join in the mockery. "Well, Judge," Carter said, turning to Benjamin with a sneer, "I think we can all agree that the elderly man has clearly lost touch with reality. I mean, how else would you explain him choosing to represent himself? With all due respect, Mr. Foster, there's nothing more pitiful than an outdated lawyer, especially one who thinks he can outsmart me. It's almost cute, really." The defense lawyer's words were cruel, and they landed with a weight in the courtroom. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads, others suppressing smiles. The tension was palpable, the air thick with skepticism. The audience glanced over at Benjamin, some exchanging whispers, others glancing at each other in disbelief. Who would let an old man, one clearly far past his prime, take on a case so serious? The whispers grew louder, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from skeptical curiosity to outright dismissal. Benjamin had every right to be upset, but he didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, unwavering. He had heard worse over the years, from the young and the old, from colleagues and opponents alike. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But what no one in the room knew was that Benjamin Foster wasn't a man to be mocked lightly. Judge Peterson, still amused, let out a chuckle and glanced down at the elderly man. "Well, Mr. Foster, the floor is yours, but I would recommend you keep it brief. We don't have all day, and I'm sure the jury would appreciate a quicker end to this battle of the ages." The judge's tone was condescending, as if he were speaking to a child. Yet Benjamin didn't react. He stood slowly, his cane tapping against the floor with each movement, and when he reached his feet, he looked directly at Judge Peterson, then at the jury, and finally at the defense attorney. His face was calm, but there was a spark in his eyes, a spark that had seen far more of the courtroom than anyone could imagine. The elderly man cleared his throat, his voice steady and low but carrying enough weight to fill the room. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his words deliberate. "I'll be brief, but I assure you I'm more than capable of handling myself." The chuckles in the room died down as Benjamin raised a hand and began to speak. It wasn't the loud, booming voice that people were used to hearing from seasoned attorneys, but there was something compelling about his words. His language was simple but precise, each sentence laced with the wisdom of someone who had spent his life studying law, not just the textbooks, but the human condition itself. Benjamin's first question to the prosecution was simple. "How do you explain the discrepancies in your client's financial records?" His tone was calm, unhurried, yet there was an underlying sharpness that cut through the air. The room went quiet. The defense attorney, Henry Carter, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The judge raised an eyebrow, his amusement waning. Benjamin's question had been calculated, strategic. The entire courtroom was now paying attention. The first crack had appeared in the defense's armor. Though everyone had dismissed him at first, Benjamin's steady demeanor and sharp mind began to show the faintest glimmer of a deeper truth. This wasn't just an elderly man who had lost his touch. This was someone who had mastered the art of law, who had spent decades observing, calculating, and winning, and he was here to show them all that appearances could be deceiving. Benjamin Foster took his time to settle into his seat. The courtroom, still buzzing from the previous remarks, fell silent. All eyes were on him now. His calmness, despite the weight of the situation, was almost unsettling to those watching. He wasn't hasty, didn't rush, and didn't give in to the pressure of being mocked. Instead, he exuded a quiet confidence that couldn't be ignored. He adjusted his glasses slowly, as though giving the room time to realize that this wasn't just any defense attorney sitting across from them. This was a man who had decades of experience, though his age and frail appearance suggested otherwise. After a moment, Benjamin cleared his throat and stood again. He reached for his cane, his fingers brushing against it lightly as he pushed himself up from the chair. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he moved toward the center, the echo of his cane tapping on the floor a rhythmic reminder of his presence. The judge, still confident in his assumptions, leaned back in his chair with a bemused look. "Mr. Foster, if you could get to the point," Judge Peterson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We don't have time for games." Benjamin ignored the comment, his eyes locked on the defendant, Richard Westbrook, sitting on the opposite side of the room. Westbrook had been smug throughout the proceedings. Too smug, as Benjamin could see. He was a man used to buying his way out of trouble, convinced that his charm and wealth would protect him. The elderly man's first question, however, was nothing like what anyone expected. He didn't dive into complex legal jargon or attack the defense directly. Instead, he began with a simple, almost seemingly innocent question. "Mr. Westbrook," he began, his voice steady but carrying an air of authority, "can you tell me where you were on the night of October 14th? The courtroom was silent. Richard blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. It wasn't a complicated legal query. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it was a question that made him pause. I was at my office," Westbrook said, fidgeting with his hands. "I had a late meeting with a client." Benjamin nodded slowly, then leaned in just slightly, as if the next question was somehow of great importance. "And who was this client?" Westbrook shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't recall their name. It was a last-minute meeting. I wasn't paying much attention." The subtle change in his tone didn't escape Benjamin's sharp ears. The young businessman, so confident just moments ago, now sounded uncertain, even defensive. There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The courtroom's audience shifted in their seats, the energy in the room changing. Something wasn't right, and Benjamin had just pointed it out, without ever raising his voice. "Interesting," Benjamin murmured, tapping his cane on the floor. "You don't remember your client's name, but you remember the meeting?" His voice was even, casual, but there was an undercurrent of something more calculated. "Tell me, Mr. Westbrook, how many clients can you say you've met with who didn't leave any record of their name or business?" The defendant's confident exterior began to crack. His face flushed slightly as he leaned forward, trying to regain his composure. "I don't see how that's relevant to this case," he snapped, but his voice lacked the force it had before. The more he spoke, the more the cracks began to show. Benjamin didn't give him time to regroup. He continued with his questions, each one more precise than the last, carefully stripping away the layers of the defendant's fabricated story. "Mr. Westbrook," he continued, his voice never rising above a calm pitch, "I've spent many years in this very courtroom. One thing I've learned is that people lie. They lie about where they were, who they were with, and what they were doing. It's in their nature, especially when they know they've done something wrong." A slight murmur rippled through the audience. The judge raised an eyebrow, looking at Benjamin now with a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Mr. Foster, can we stick to the facts?" the judge snapped, clearly uncomfortable with the elderly man's approach. "You're getting off track." Benjamin, unbothered by the interruption, took a slow breath before responding. "I'm simply asking questions, Your Honor," he said softly. "Questions that need to be answered." But the judge, still unconvinced, remained unimpressed. He shot Benjamin a pointed look. "This is not a place for storytelling, Mr. Foster. Stick to the law." The audience watched in silence, but Benjamin didn't flinch. He didn't need to prove anything to the judge or anyone else in the room. The question wasn't about proving his knowledge. It was about slowly unveiling the truth, piece by piece, and waiting for the right moment to strike. As Benjamin continued to question Westbrook, subtle flashbacks played out in his mind, hidden beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. He remembered days in the courtroom, years ago, arguing complex cases with attorneys who thought they could outsmart him. He remembered moments spent in high-stakes negotiations with businessmen like Richard Westbrook, watching them squirm as they realized they couldn't buy their way out of trouble. He remembered the cases that had defined his career, the cases where he had stood in front of judges far more powerful than Peterson, challenging their assumptions, proving them wrong, and winning against all odds. These memories weren't just nostalgia. They were the very tools Benjamin used now. His age wasn't a burden, it was an advantage. He continued with his questions, each one carefully crafted, each one revealing more of Westbrook's discomfort. By the time Benjamin had finished his line of questioning, the audience could feel the shift. Westbrook's smugness had all but vanished. His earlier confidence had been replaced with unease. The defendant's once perfect facade had cracked, and a feeling of doubt lingered in the air. Benjamin, with his frail appearance and calm demeanor, had managed to turn the tide in a matter of minutes. The judge may have mocked him, the defense lawyer may have written him off, but now the entire courtroom was starting to wonder, had they underestimated Benjamin Foster? Or worse, had they missed something important, something they would regret not seeing earlier? Benjamin Foster's first move wasn't just a question, it was a statement that no one, not even the judge, could ignore. The courtroom was now heavy with tension. The cracks in Richard Westbrook's story were beginning to show, but Benjamin Foster was far from finished. As the elderly man continued to press the defendant, the subtle rhythm of his questioning started to build toward something far more dangerous for Westbrook than anyone had anticipated. No one had expected it to unfold this way. Not the judge, not the defendant, and certainly not the jury. Benjamin turned his attention back to the evidence. He didn't need to raise his voice, nor did he need to employ flashy legal jargon. What he needed was something simple, something that would expose the truth while appearing entirely ordinary to those who didn't understand how to look at it. He slowly reached into the briefcase resting on the defense table and pulled out a folder of papers. The room watched in silence as he unfolded the stack and laid it on the table. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B into evidence," Benjamin said, his voice calm and composed. Judge Peterson glanced at the folder with some suspicion, but nodded. "Proceed." Benjamin turned to the jury, his face neutral but commanding. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is a series of financial transactions from Mr. Westbrook's company. On the surface, they seem legitimate, but if you look closely, you'll see something unusual." He slid a document across the table and pointed to a series of numbers. "These figures are the transactions for October 14th, the night Mr. Westbrook claims he was at his office meeting a client." He paused, letting the room soak in the significance of what he was saying. Then, in a quiet voice, he added, "However, there's a discrepancy here. You'll notice that, despite the defendant's claims, these transactions were logged into the system after midnight, the kind of transaction that would require a specific signature, one that only Mr. Westbrook could have authorized." A low murmur ran through the courtroom. Westbrook's face paled for a moment, his earlier smugness evaporating. Benjamin's eyes locked onto the young businessman's, unblinking. "Mr. Westbrook," Benjamin continued, his voice cutting through the growing tension, "can you explain how these transactions were approved after you left your supposed client meeting?" The defendant opened his mouth, but no words came out. He shut it quickly, his hands now visibly trembling. The room grew quieter as everyone waited for him to respond. "This is absurd," Westbrook finally blurted out, his voice defensive but shaky. "Those transactions were authorized by my assistant. I wasn't involved in them. I don't know why they're showing up that way." Benjamin didn't even flinch. "I see. Your assistant authorized these transactions while you were supposedly meeting with a client. But, Mr. Westbrook, you see, the timestamps don't match up. The assistant was not in the office when the transactions were logged. In fact, she was on leave that night, and the authorization came from your personal login credentials." Westbrook's face twisted in confusion and panic. "That's impossible," he exclaimed. "Oh, you're lying. I didn't authorize any transactions." "Really?" Benjamin's tone was calm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because the company's system shows otherwise. Every piece of evidence here points directly to you, Mr. Westbrook. Your assistant had no access to your login details. The only person who could have authorized these transactions is you." Benjamin took a step back and gestured toward the jury, allowing them to look at the document he'd just presented. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I've shown you is clear evidence of manipulation and deceit. Richard Westbrook didn't just lie about his whereabouts that night. He used his company to cover up fraudulent transactions." The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Westbrook's usual confidence had shattered, and now he was scrambling for answers. His previous arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a desperate attempt to save himself. He looked at his lawyer, Henry Carter, who sat frozen, unsure of how to recover from the bombshell that had just been dropped. Benjamin gave the defendant a moment to digest what had been exposed before continuing. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to be. "Mr. Westbrook," Benjamin said softly, "you said earlier that you didn't remember the name of your client from the meeting on the 14th. Now you've just admitted that you were at your office, alone, authorizing transactions in the middle of the night. But what if I told you that the truth is much worse than that?" Westbrook's jaw clenched as he tried to maintain his composure, but the crack in his defenses was becoming increasingly wide. Benjamin's next question hit like a bolt of lightning. "Mr. Westbrook, did you authorize these transactions to cover up the theft of company funds?" The room was silent again. The defense lawyer, Carter, tried to interject, but the words died on his lips as Benjamin slid a second document across the table, one that contained a list of accounts linked to Westbrook's company and several questionable transfers of large sums to personal offshore accounts. The defendant's face turned an even deeper shade of red. His eyes darted around the room, but no one was looking at him with sympathy anymore. The game was up. Benjamin continued to dismantle the defendant's story, each question cutting deeper than the last. The audience sat in stunned silence as the elderly man, with a calmness that belied his age, methodically tore through the lies. There was no flashy spectacle, just simple facts, delivered with precision and authority. Judge Peterson, once confident and mocking, had fallen silent. His earlier smirk had long since faded. The more Benjamin exposed, the more the judge's attitude shifted. No longer was he dismissive. No longer was he certain of the outcome. The evidence was irrefutable. Westbrook, now visibly sweating, shifted in his seat as the weight of the truth bore down on him. His eyes flickered between the evidence Benjamin presented and the growing scrutiny of the jury. The cracks in his story were now so wide that they could no longer be ignored. "Mr. Westbrook," Benjamin said one last time, his voice firm, "you've had your chance to explain yourself. Now, it's time for the truth to be known. You did not just manipulate your company's records. You tried to deceive us all. You tried to deceive the court, and you failed." The room was heavy with the silence that followed. Westbrook's smugness had evaporated, leaving only the hollow remnants of a man caught in his lies. Judge Peterson, no longer able to dismiss the elderly man, looked at the defendant with a steely gaze. "Mr. Westbrook," he said, his voice no longer filled with arrogance, You have some explaining to do." The entire courtroom held its breath. Benjamin had done it. The truth was out, and Westbrook's downfall had been set in motion. The elderly man had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that sometimes the greatest strength lies in quiet intelligence, not loud words or flashy displays. And the moment had arrived. Justice would finally prevail. The courtroom was still buzzing with the weight of the evidence Benjamin Foster had just presented. The mood had shifted entirely. No longer were the judge and the defendant in control. The jury's eyes were fixed on the elderly man, whose calm demeanor now radiated an unsettling sense of confidence. Westbrook, still shaking with panic, nervously wiped his forehead as his attorney, Henry Carter, desperately flipped through pages in his briefcase, trying to find some way to regain control of the situation. But every move they made felt futile. The walls were closing in, and they knew it. Benjamin took a slow, deliberate breath as he watched the chaos unfold. He had waited for this moment, the final move that would expose the truth, the move that would lay bare his true identity. As the room waited for the next words to come from his lips, Benjamin stood tall, his cane tapping lightly on the floor as he turned to face the judge. Judge Peterson, who had been trying to maintain his composure, had finally stopped pretending. The weight of what was happening had settled on his shoulders, and he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. His earlier mockery had transformed into nervous curiosity. It was as if he was now watching a master at work, one who was far beyond the point of being dismissed. Benjamin paused for a moment, taking in the atmosphere before finally speaking. His voice was calm, almost casual, but it held an unmistakable edge. "Your Honor," he began, "before we move any further, I feel there is something I should share with you, something I should have made clear at the start of this trial." He looked down at the defendant, Richard Westbrook, and then back at the judge. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Peterson raised an eyebrow, clearly perplexed. "What do you mean, Mr. Foster?" he asked, his tone still skeptical, but now edged with a growing uncertainty. Benjamin smiled ever so slightly, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not just an old man representing himself in court, Your Honor. I'm someone who has been at the heart of this very profession for more years than you might imagine, and I think it's time you all know exactly who I am." The room was silent. The defendant's lawyer, Carter, stopped flipping through his papers and looked up, confusion written across his face. The jurors exchanged confused glances, wondering what was coming next. But it was clear that no one, not even the judge, had seen this coming. Benjamin slowly unbuttoned his coat and reached inside, pulling out a small leather-bound portfolio. He placed it on the table and slid it across to the judge. The courtroom remained still, the weight of anticipation hanging heavily in the air. Peterson glanced at the portfolio, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "I think it's time you read this," Benjamin said, his voice quiet but commanding. The judge reluctantly picked up the portfolio, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the documents, but the more he read, the more his face went pale. His hand began to tremble as he quickly scanned the pages. The audience, sensing something monumental was about to happen, watched with bated breath. As the judge read, the courtroom's silence grew thicker, the only sound now the rustling of paper. Finally, Judge Peterson looked up, his mouth slightly agape. "Mr. Foster," he began, his voice faltering. You're Benjamin Foster?" Benjamin nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, Your Honor. You see, while you were busy assuming I was just some old man, I was once a name known in every major courtroom across this country. I've represented Fortune 500 companies, politicians, even some of the world's most powerful individuals. I was part of some of the most high-profile cases of the century, but I retired years ago. Or so it seemed." There was an audible gasp from the courtroom. The judge stood up, stunned, as if he had just discovered he had been playing a game with someone far more skilled than he had ever imagined. The murmurs from the audience became a low hum as they tried to process what had just been revealed. Benjamin Foster, the legendary litigator? Judge Peterson's voice was barely above a whisper, his disbelief clear. The Benjamin Foster who won the landmark case against the Commonwealth Trust. The one who argued before the Supreme Court. "That's correct," Benjamin said, his voice calm but firm. "I am the same man who put an end to countless fraudulent schemes, took down corporations with ties to organized crime, and uncovered secrets that no one thought could be uncovered. But, like I said, I retired. I stepped away from the spotlight years ago, not because I couldn't continue, but because I chose to." The shock in the courtroom was palpable. The defendant, Richard Westbrook, who had been so sure of his victory, now sat in stunned silence. His arrogant posture had deflated completely, and he couldn't even bring himself to look at the elderly man who had just revealed his true identity. The judge seemed almost paralyzed, staring at Benjamin in disbelief. But why didn't you tell me this earlier? Why didn't you just come forward with this?" Benjamin's expression softened, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. "Because I didn't need to. I didn't need anyone to know my name, or my history. I didn't need any special treatment. I only needed the truth to come out." He turned to face the jury, his voice steady as he addressed them directly. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimony. Now, you know who I am. But more importantly, you know the truth about Richard Westbrook and his fraudulent activities. His lies have been exposed, and the damage they've caused is irreparable." Benjamin paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. He then took a breath and delivered the final blow. "The truth is, Mr. Westbrook, you're not just a businessman who got caught up in a moment of greed. You're a criminal, and you tried to cover your tracks. You thought no one would notice, but the truth always comes out, and I am here to make sure it does." The judge, now fully aware of his own misjudgment, swallowed hard. He glanced over at Benjamin, his face flushed with embarrassment. I underestimated you, Mr. Foster," Judge Peterson admitted, his voice lower than before. "I failed to see who you truly are." Benjamin nodded, his gaze unwavering. "It's not the first time, but the truth has a way of making itself known in the end." The room was still. There was no more doubt. There was no more room for argument. The elderly man, underestimated and mocked, had just dismantled a criminal's empire with a single revelation. The trial was over, and the truth had won. The jury, now fully convinced of Westbrook's guilt, began to deliberate, and there was little doubt about the outcome. Richard Westbrook's fate was sealed. As Benjamin Foster quietly sat back down, he didn't need to speak again. His reputation had been revealed, not through boasts or claims, but through the irrefutable power of his legal mind and the undeniable truth of his words. And in that moment, the courtroom learned a hard lesson. Never judge someone based on their appearance, especially when they're hiding a genius beneath. The room was still, the tension palpable as the jury deliberated, and everyone waited for the inevitable verdict. Richard Westbrook's world had come crashing down. His smugness had dissolved into fear, his confidence replaced by the stark reality of his guilt. It didn't take long for the jury to reach their decision. The evidence was clear, the lies exposed, and the truth undeniable. As the verdict was read, the courtroom filled with a sense of relief. Westbrook had been found guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of financial manipulation. The chains of his lies had finally been broken, and justice had prevailed. Benjamin Foster sat quietly, his face a mask of composure. He had done what he came to do. His purpose wasn't to seek recognition or accolades. It was to ensure that the truth came to light. He had faced mockery, ridicule, and doubt, but in the end, it was his unwavering belief in justice that had won out. Judge Peterson, still standing at the bench, finally turned to Benjamin. His expression had shifted from one of arrogance to one of deep humility. "Mr. Foster," he began, his voice soft, "I owe you an apology. I should have never doubted you. I made a grave error in judgment." Benjamin didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the judge's words. He didn't need the apology. What mattered was the outcome. What mattered was that justice had been served. The elderly man stood, his cane tapping lightly on the floor as he made his way toward the exit. He didn't look back. There was no dramatic flourish, no grand gesture of victory. He didn't need to make a spectacle of his success. He had fought for the truth, and that was enough. As he left the courtroom, his heart was light, not because of the victory, but because he had fulfilled the one thing he had always set out to do: deliver justice. The story wasn't about proving anyone wrong or about showing off his brilliance. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. It was a story of how prejudice and underestimation could blind people to the truth, and how sometimes it takes the most unexpected person to reveal what others refuse to see. Benjamin Foster had reminded everyone in that courtroom that wisdom, integrity, and truth had no expiration date. Age was not a barrier to greatness. It was simply a different perspective that could see the world in ways others could not. And, in the end, it was that very wisdom that had saved the day. If you were surprised by this turn of events, make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable stories like this one. From courtroom dramas to untold twists, our channel is filled with stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You don't want to miss the next shocking revelation. We have more unexpected stories lined up, stories that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew. So, make sure you hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. There's so much more to uncover, and you won't want to miss a single twist. Justice has been served today, but there's more to come. Stay with us for more incredible stories that you won't believe. See you in the next one.